I never thought I'd be tracking my own car like a criminal, but there I was, sitting in a Mexican resort restaurant, staring at my phone screen in complete disbelief. The little blue dot that represented my 2019 Honda Civic was moving through downtown Denver while I was supposed to be sipping margaritas in Cabo San Lucas. That's when I knew Patricia had crossed a line she could never uncross. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole mess started 6 months earlier when I married David Chen, thinking I was gaining not just a husband but a loving family. I should have seen the warning signs during our engagement when Patricia would make subtle comments about my impractical career choices or how I probably didn't understand the value of money since I worked as a graphic designer instead of pursuing something more stable like nursing or teaching. David would laugh it off, telling me his mother just needed time to warm up to me, that she was protective of her only son. Patricia Chen was the kind of woman who never directly insulted you, but somehow left you feeling diminished after every conversation. She had perfected the art of backhanded compliments wrapped in concerned smiles. When David and I announced our engagement, her first response wasn't congratulations, but a thoughtful nod followed by, "Well, I suppose love conquers all, doesn't it?" The implication being that love would have to work overtime to overcome whatever deficiencies she saw in me. I was 28, working at a small design firm in Denver's Highlands neighborhood, living in a cozy apartment I decorated with vintage finds and my own artwork. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I drove my reliable Honda Civic, which I'd bought used but maintained meticulously, and I was proud of the independence I'd built for myself. The car represented more than transportation to me. It was freedom, reliability, and the first major purchase I'd made entirely on my own. David worked in software development at a tech startup downtown, and we'd met at a coffee shop where I was sketching ideas for a client project. He'd approached me, genuinely curious about my work, and we'd ended up talking for 3 hours about design, technology, and our shared love of hiking Colorado's mountain trails. Unlike the men I'd dated before, David seemed to genuinely respect my career and creative ambitions. He never made me feel like I needed to apologize for choosing passion over a bigger paycheck. Our relationship developed naturally over 8 months of weekend adventures, quiet dinners, and long conversations about everything from sustainable design to our dreams of traveling the world together. David was kind, intelligent, and surprisingly romantic for someone who spent his days writing code. When he proposed during a sunset hike at Garden of the Gods, I said yes without hesitation, genuinely believing I'd found my person. The wedding planning process revealed more of Patricia's true nature. She questioned every decision, from the venue choice to my dress selection, always with that same concerned expression that suggested I was making mistake after mistake. When I chose a simple ceremony at a local botanical garden instead of the country club she'd suggested, she sighed deeply and told David, "I just hope Sophia understands what she's giving up." When I selected a vintage-inspired dress from a boutique instead of shopping at the department stores she recommended, she commented that it was interesting and very unique, managing to make both words sound like gentle criticisms. David consistently defended me, but I began to notice he did so privately, never confronting his mother directly about her behavior. Instead, he'd apologize to me afterward, explaining that Patricia had high standards and just wanted the best for us. I started to realize that keeping peace in his family meant I was expected to absorb his mother's criticisms without complaint. The wedding itself was beautiful, despite Patricia's attempts to micromanage every detail. My parents, who had flown in from Phoenix, were warm and welcoming to David's family, which made Patricia's cool politeness toward them even more noticeable. During the reception, I overheard her telling David's aunt that she hoped marriage would help me mature and understand family priorities better. The comment stung, but I was determined not to let her negativity overshadow what should have been the happiest day of my life. After the wedding, David and I moved into a larger apartment in the same neighborhood where I'd been living. Patricia immediately began offering unsolicited advice about our living arrangements, suggesting we should consider buying a house in the suburbs where she lived, claiming the schools were better for when we started a family. The assumption that we'd automatically want children and that her opinion on where we should raise them mattered irritated me, but David seemed oblivious to the presumption. My Honda Civic became an unexpected source of tension. Patricia would make comments about how unreliable used cars could be and how I should consider letting David help me get something newer and more practical. She'd mention safety features in newer models and suggest that as a married woman, I should prioritize security over sentimentality. The implication was clear. My car, like many of my choices, was immature and impractical. What Patricia didn't know was that I'd had a GPS tracking device installed in my car after a series of break-ins in my neighborhood the previous year. My insurance company had recommended it, and I'd thought it was a smart precaution. The device was small, hidden under the dashboard, and connected to an app on my phone that I rarely checked since I'd never needed to use it. It was just there, a silent guardian I'd forgotten about until that day in Cabo. The troubles escalated when David and I decided to take a vacation to Mexico for our 6-month anniversary. Patricia was immediately disapproving, questioning why we needed to spend money on travel when we could be saving for a house. She suggested we could have a perfectly nice vacation visiting his cousin in Colorado Springs, saving the international travel for when we were more established. Her tone suggested that wanting to see the world was another sign of my immaturity. Despite her objections, David and I booked a week in Cabo San Lucas. We were both excited for the chance to relax, explore a new place together, and enjoy some time away from the pressures of work and family expectations. I'd saved for months to afford the trip, working extra freelance projects to fund what I saw as an important investment in our relationship. The planning process became another source of friction with Patricia. She insisted on having a spare key to our apartment for emergencies, and suggested she should check on our place while we were gone. David thought it was thoughtful, but something about her eagerness to have access to our home made me uncomfortable. When I mentioned that our neighbor had already agreed to collect our mail and water the plants, Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "I just think family should take care of family," she said with that familiar concerned tone. "Neighbors are nice, but they don't have the same investment in your well-being." Against my better judgment, I agreed to give her a spare key, telling myself I was being paranoid and that David's mother was just trying to be helpful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The decision would prove to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life. The night before our departure, Patricia called to remind us about various things we should be careful about while traveling. She mentioned crime rates, food safety, and the importance of keeping our valuables secure. Then, almost casually, she brought up my car again. "You know, Sophia, I've been thinking about your Honda sitting in that parking lot for a week. Cars that sit unused can develop problems, and that neighborhood has had some theft issues lately. Maybe you should consider parking it somewhere safer. Or better yet, this might be a good time to think about upgrading to something more reliable." I thanked her for the concern, but assured her that my car would be fine in our secured parking garage. The conversation left me with an uneasy feeling, but I dismissed it as pre-travel nerves. David and I flew out the next morning, both of us excited and ready to disconnect from our everyday responsibilities. The first few days in Cabo were perfect. Beautiful beaches, delicious food, and the kind of relaxed intimacy that had brought us together in the first place. We snorkeled, explored local markets, and spent hours talking about our future together without the constant background noise of family obligations and work stress. On our fourth day, we were having lunch at a beachside restaurant when I decided to check my phone for messages. Along with the usual vacation photos from friends and work emails I was ignoring, I noticed a notification from an app I rarely used, my car's GPS tracking system. My heart started racing as I opened the app and saw that my car was no longer in our apartment's parking garage. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I need to show you something." I handed him my phone, showing him the moving blue dot that represented my Honda driving through downtown Denver in real time. His face went pale as he realized what we were looking at. "There has to be an explanation," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it was towed for some reason, or maybe the tracker is malfunctioning." But we both knew the truth was probably much simpler and much worse. I called our neighbor, who confirmed that there had been no towing notices and that she hadn't seen any unusual activity around our building. When I asked if she'd seen David's mother at our apartment, there was a pause before she admitted that yes, Patricia had been there the day before, and she'd seen her in the parking garage. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had used our vacation as an opportunity to take my car without permission. The woman who had criticized my choices, questioned my judgment, and treated me like an immature child had stolen from me while I was out of the country, probably thinking I'd never find out until it was too late to do anything about it. David immediately called his mother, but she didn't answer. He left increasingly urgent voicemails asking her to call back immediately, but hours passed with no response. Meanwhile, I watched my car's location on the GPS app, feeling a growing sense of violation and rage as I realized the full scope of what Patricia had done. The blue dot eventually stopped moving, settling at an address I didn't recognize in a part of Denver I rarely visited. When I looked up the address online, my worst fears were confirmed. It was a used car dealership. Patricia hadn't just taken my car, she had sold it. The rest of our vacation was ruined. Instead of enjoying our last few days in paradise, David and I spent hours on the phone trying to reach Patricia and figure out what legal recourse we might have. David was devastated, torn between loyalty to his mother and anger at what she'd done to me. I was furious, hurt, and beginning to realize that this wasn't just about a car. It was about respect, boundaries, and the kind of person I'd married into a family with. When Patricia finally called back, her tone was casual, almost cheerful, as if she'd done us a favor rather than committed a crime. She explained that she'd been worried about my car sitting unused and had happened to mention to a friend who owned a dealership that we might be interested in selling it. The friend had made a generous offer, and she'd thought it would be a nice surprise for us to come home to some extra money instead of an old car. The lies were so blatant, so insulting to our intelligence that I could barely speak. She claimed she'd tried to call us but couldn't get through, though our phones had been working perfectly and she'd made no such attempts. She insisted she was just looking out for our best interests, that the money would be better used for a down payment on a house than wasted on maintaining an unreliable vehicle. "I thought you'd be grateful," she said, and I could hear the familiar condescending tone even through the phone's speaker. "This way you can get something newer, safer, more appropriate for a married couple." David's response was weak, asking her how she could have done such a thing without asking us first. Patricia's answer revealed the true depth of her manipulation. She claimed she had tried to reach us, that she'd been given permission to make decisions in our absence, and that she'd acted out of love and concern for our future. The conversation ended with Patricia promising to explain everything when we returned, but I already knew there would be no explanation that could justify what she'd done. She had violated our trust, stolen my property, and then lied about it, with the confidence of someone who expected to get away with it. Sitting in that Mexican restaurant, staring at my phone and watching the GPS tracker show my car's final location at a dealership I'd never heard of, I realized that this wasn't just about transportation or money. This was about power, control, and the message Patricia was sending about my place in her son's life. She had taken something that represented my independence and made a unilateral decision about my property as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted to make my own choices. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected because it confirmed every subtle put-down, every concerned suggestion, every moment when I'd felt like Patricia was trying to diminish my agency in my own life. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated power play designed to show me exactly how little my opinions and boundaries mattered to her. As our plane lifted off from Cabo 2 days later, I stared out the window, at the ocean below, and realized that everything was about to change. Patricia had made a choice that would define our relationship forever, and I was about to make some choices of my own. The flight back to Denver felt like the longest 7 hours of my life. David sat beside me, alternating between apologetic glances and staring blankly at the airline magazine he'd been flipping through for the past hour without reading. I could feel his internal struggle radiating off him like heat, but I was too raw to offer him comfort. My mind kept cycling through the same thoughts. How could she do this? How could he let her do this? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? When we landed at Denver International Airport, I had 17 missed calls from Patricia and a series of increasingly frantic text messages. The first few were variations of, "Call me when you land, we need to talk." But by the final message, her tone had shifted to something more commanding. "Sophia, you're overreacting. Come to the house when you get back so we can discuss this like adults." The audacity of her demanding that I come to her house, as if I were a child being summoned to the principal's office, made my hands shake with rage. David read the messages over my shoulder and winced visibly. "She's really stepped in it this time," he muttered, which was probably the strongest criticism I'd ever heard him voice about his mother. Stepped in it? I turned to face him fully. "David, she stole my car. She didn't step in anything. She committed a crime." He ran his fingers through his hair, a nervous habit I'd grown to recognize over the months we'd been together. I know. I can't believe she actually went through with selling it. When she was talking about your car before we left, I thought she was just being her usual worried self." "You knew she was planning something?" The words came out, sharper than I'd intended, but I couldn't take them back. "No, not exactly. She just mentioned that she thought you should consider getting a newer car, maybe something more reliable. I told her that was your decision to make, but you know how she is. She gets an idea in her head and won't let it go." The casualness with which he described her obsession with my car choices made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior that David had been enabling by treating his mother's controlling tendencies as quirky personality traits rather than serious boundary violations. We took a taxi home from the airport, and I spent the entire ride staring out the window at the familiar Denver skyline, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. My car was gone, sold to strangers, and the money was sitting in Patricia's bank account while she crafted explanations for why she'd done me such a tremendous favor. The violation felt almost physical, like she'd reached into my life and rearranged everything to suit her preferences. Our apartment looked exactly the same as we'd left it, but everything felt different now. The space that had represented our new life together now felt contaminated by Patricia's interference. I walked straight to the window that overlooked the parking garage and stared down at the empty space where my Honda should have been parked. David came up behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders. "We'll figure this out, Soph. I'll make her buy you a replacement car, something even better than what you had." I shrugged away from his touch. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" he asked, and the genuine confusion in his voice made me realize how fundamentally we were misunderstanding each other. "The point is that she had no right to make that decision. The point is that she violated our trust and our home. The point is that she stole from me and then lied about it, and you're talking about it like it's a problem that can be solved by throwing money at it." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to find a response that would somehow make this situation manageable. Finally, he said, "What do you want me to do, Sophia? She's my mother. I can't just cut her out of my life." "I'm not asking you to cut her out of your life. I'm asking you to acknowledge that what she did was wrong and to make sure it never happens again." "Of course it was wrong," he said quickly. "I never said it wasn't wrong, but she genuinely thought she was helping us. You know how she is about money and planning for the future. In her mind, she was probably thinking about how we could use that money for a house down payment or something practical. The fact that he was already making excuses for her, already trying to find ways to justify her behavior, made me realize that this conversation was going to be much harder than I'd anticipated. David had spent his entire life learning to accommodate his mother's controlling behavior by reframing it as concern or love. He couldn't see that her actions weren't misguided helpfulness. They were deliberate attempts to control and diminish me. I spent the rest of the evening researching my legal options while David called his mother to arrange a meeting. The conversation I could hear from the kitchen was frustratingly one-sided, with David saying things like, "I understand you were trying to help," and, "Yes, I know you were worried about the car sitting there." There was no anger in his voice, no demand for accountability, just the same patient tone he might use with a child who had broken something by accident. When he hung up, he found me at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts about auto theft laws and consumer protection regulations. "She wants to meet tomorrow afternoon," he said. "She's going to bring the money from the sale and help us find a replacement car." "She's going to bring my money," I corrected. "Money from selling my property without my permission." "Right, of course. Your money." The way he said it, like he was agreeing just to keep the peace, made it clear that he still didn't fully grasp the severity of what his mother had done. In his mind, this was a family disagreement that could be resolved with a sincere apology and some practical problem-solving. He couldn't see that Patricia's actions had revealed something fundamental about how she viewed me and my place in their family dynamic. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me. The more I thought about Patricia's behavior, the more I realized that this incident was just the culmination of months of smaller violations, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the suggestions that my choices were impractical or immature, the way she inserted herself into our decisions as if her opinion carried more weight than mine. It had all been building to this moment. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I printed out documentation of the car's value, researched the legal definition of theft, and prepared a list of every boundary Patricia had crossed since David and I had started dating. I wanted to be armed with facts and examples, not just emotions and hurt feelings. David seemed nervous as we drove to his mother's house in his car, fidgeting with the radio and making small talk about our neighbors and the weather. I recognized the behavior. It was the same way he acted before any family gathering, unconsciously preparing himself to manage the complex dynamics of dealing with Patricia. Patricia's house was a pristine suburban colonial in a neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every driveway was free of oil stains. She'd lived there since David was in high school, after his father had left the family for a younger woman and a fresh start in California. The house represented everything Patricia valued: stability, respectability, and the appearance of success. She answered the door wearing the same concerned expression she'd worn throughout our wedding planning, the one that suggested she was dealing with a situation that was unfortunate but manageable with the right approach. "Sophia, dear," she said, reaching out to hug me as if nothing had happened. "I'm so glad you're both home safely. How was the rest of your trip?" The casual tone, the implication that our vacation had been ruined by my overreaction rather than her criminal behavior, made my jaw clench. I stepped back from her attempted embrace and followed David into the living room, where Patricia had laid out coffee and pastries as if this were a social visit. I have the check right here, she said, pulling an envelope from her purse. Mr. Henderson at the dealership was very fair. He gave us much more than I expected for a car that age. The way she said us, as if we were partners in this transaction, made my stomach turn. I took the envelope and looked at the amount, $3,200, which was probably fair market value for my Honda, but wasn't the point at all. Patricia, I said, setting the check on the coffee table without opening it fully, I need you to understand something. What you did was theft. You took my property without permission and sold it. The fact that you're giving me the money doesn't change the fact that you committed a crime. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see her recalibrating her approach. The concerned grandmother routine wasn't working, so she was switching to something more direct. Sophia, I understand you're upset, but I really did think I was helping. That car was just sitting there, and I happened to mention to Mr. Henderson that young people today don't always understand the value of upgrading to something more reliable. When he made such a generous offer, I thought it would be a wonderful surprise for you both to come home to some extra money. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, that I realized she'd probably been rehearsing this explanation since the moment she'd signed the title transfer. But there was something else in her tone now, something that suggested she was getting tired of pretending to be apologetic. The problem is, I continued, you didn't have the right to make that decision. It wasn't your car to sell. Well, technically, dear, you're family now, and families help each other make smart financial decisions. The word technically hung in the air like a slap. She was suggesting that my marriage to David had somehow transferred ownership of my possessions to the family collective, with her as the final authority on what constituted smart decision-making. David shifted uncomfortably beside me. Mom, I think what Sophia is trying to say is that you should have asked first. Even if you thought it was a good idea, you should have called us. I tried to call, Patricia said, and I could hear the edge creeping into her voice. But you were unreachable, and I couldn't let such a good opportunity slip away. Mr. Henderson was only in town for a few days, and he was offering cash on the spot. We were not unreachable, I said firmly. Our phones worked perfectly fine, and you never tried to call us. You're lying. The accusation of lying seemed to flip a switch in Patricia. The concerned mask slipped completely, and I got my first glimpse of the woman who had raised David to accommodate her every whim and opinion. Excuse me? She said, her voice sharp. I don't appreciate being called a liar in my own home. And I don't appreciate having my car stolen while I'm on vacation, I replied, matching her tone. David immediately jumped in, trying to play peacemaker. Okay. Let's all take a breath here. Mom, you should have gotten permission before selling Sophia's car. Sophia? I'm sure Mom really did think she was helping. But I was done with David's diplomatic approach. Patricia's behavior had shown me exactly what she thought of me and my place in this family, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise anymore. No, David, I said, standing up from the couch. Your mother didn't think she was helping. She thought she could get away with stealing from me because she doesn't respect me or my decisions. She's been undermining me since the day we met, and this is just the most blatant example. Patricia's face flushed red. I have never undermined you, Sophia. I've tried to help you understand what it means to be part of this family, to think about the future instead of living like a college student forever. There it is, I said, feeling a strange sense of relief at finally hearing her honest opinion. You think I'm immature and irresponsible, so you decided to take matters into your own hands. You stole my car because you don't think I'm capable of making my own decisions. I wouldn't have to make decisions for you if you made better ones yourself, she snapped, and immediately looked like she regretted the words. The room went silent. David stared at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something like recognition. He was finally seeing what I'd been dealing with for months, the constant judgment and control that Patricia had disguised as maternal concern. "Mom," he said quietly, "that's not okay." "Oh, don't you start," Patricia said, turning her attention to her son. "I've been looking out for this family long before she came along, and I'll be looking out for it long after she realizes that marriage requires more maturity than she's shown so far." The implication that our marriage was temporary, that I was just a phase David would eventually outgrow, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the car or even about respect. This was about Patricia's fundamental belief that I wasn't good enough for her son and never would be. "Get out," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I want you to leave." "This is my house," Patricia replied, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Then we'll leave," I said, grabbing my purse and the check. "David, we're going." David looked between his mother and me, and I could see the moment when he realized he had to choose. For the first time in our relationship, his mother's behavior was so obviously wrong that he couldn't find a way to smooth it over or make excuses. "Mom," he said, standing up, "you owe Sophia an apology. A real one, not this defensive nonsense." "I don't owe her anything," Patricia said, but her voice was shaking now. "I'm the one who's been insulted and called a liar in my own home." "You are a liar," I said, no longer caring about being polite. "You lied about trying to call us. You lied about getting permission, and you're lying to yourself if you think what you did was anything other than theft motivated by your complete lack of respect for me." I walked toward the door, and after a moment's hesitation, David followed me. Patricia called after us, her voice high and strained, but I didn't turn around. I was done with her manipulation, done with her games, and done with being treated like an inconvenience in my own marriage. In the car, David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry. I had no idea she felt that way about you." "Yes, you did," I replied, looking out the window at the perfectly manicured suburban landscape. "You've always known. You just chose to ignore it because it was easier than dealing with her." "That's not fair." "Isn't it? How many times has she criticized my job, my car, my apartment, my choices? How many times have you listened to her do it and said nothing?" David pulled into our apartment complex and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out of the car. "What do you want me to do, Sophia? She's my mother. I can't just cut her out of my life." "I'm not asking you to cut her out of your life. I'm asking you to set boundaries. I'm asking you to make it clear that she can't treat me like this anymore." "And if she doesn't change?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that David was asking me to make a choice I wasn't ready to make. He was asking me to choose between his mother and our marriage, between my self-respect and my love for him. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that her behavior is normal or acceptable. And I can't keep being married to someone who won't defend me when his mother treats me like garbage." That night, I called my best friend Hannah, who had moved to Austin the previous year for a job at a tech startup. I told her everything: the car, the confrontation, David's inability to stand up to his mother, and my growing realization that this marriage might not survive the fundamental differences in how we viewed family loyalty and respect. "Come visit me," Hannah said without hesitation. "Take some time to think about what you want to do next. Austin's great, and I have a guest room with your name on it." The invitation felt like a lifeline, a chance to step outside the situation and gain some perspective. I looked around our apartment, at the life David and I had built together, and wondered if it was worth fighting for, or if Patricia's theft had simply revealed cracks that had been there all along. David found me packing a suitcase the next morning. He didn't ask where I was going. He just sat on the edge of the bed and watched me fold clothes with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control in a situation that had spiraled beyond recognition. "How long will you be gone?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I said, because it was the truth. I didn't know if this was a temporary break or the beginning of the end. I didn't know if David would use this time to set boundaries with his mother, or if he would spend it trying to convince me to accept her behavior. I didn't know anything except that I needed space to figure out who I was outside of this marriage and this family dynamic. "I love you," he said as I zipped up my suitcase. "I know," I replied. But sometimes love isn't enough. The drive from Denver to Austin stretched across 12 hours of highway that felt like a tunnel through my old life into something completely unknown. I'd loaded everything I thought I might need into David's car, since mine was sitting on some stranger's driveway thanks to Patricia's intervention. The irony of having to borrow my husband's vehicle to escape the situation his mother had created wasn't lost on me. Hannah had texted me the address of her apartment complex and instructions for finding the spare key, along with a message that simply said, "Drive safe, everything else can wait." Her understanding without needing explanations reminded me of what real friendship looked like, what it felt like to have someone in your corner without conditions or judgments. I stopped for gas in Amarillo as the sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly vast after Denver's mountain-framed horizons. Standing beside the car at the gas pump, breathing in the dry desert air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of starting over. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Austin greeted me with traffic that made Denver's rush hour look quaint, but there was an energy to the city that I could feel even through my exhaustion. The music scene, the food trucks, the creative community that Hannah had described in her phone calls. It all seemed to pulse with a vitality that made me realize how stagnant my life in Denver had become. Hannah's apartment was in South Austin, in a complex surrounded by live oaks and food trailers that stayed open late for the musicians and artists who kept the city's creative heart beating. She was waiting for me in the parking lot when I pulled up, having tracked my location through our shared app, and the sight of her familiar face made me cry for the first time since leaving Denver. "Okay, here's the deal," she said after we'd gotten my bags inside and I'd collapsed onto her couch with a beer. "You can stay as long as you need to, no questions asked. You can talk about what happened, or you can pretend it never existed. You can job hunt, or you can spend 3 weeks eating tacos and figuring out your life. Whatever you need." The unconditional support was such a stark contrast to the conditional acceptance I'd been living with that it took me a moment to find my voice. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. "Then don't start anywhere. Just be here for now." For the first week, I did exactly that. I slept late, explored Hannah's neighborhood, and slowly began to decompress from the constant state of tension I'd been living in without realizing it. Hannah worked from home as a UX designer for a sustainable technology company, and I found myself fascinated by her projects and the creative energy that surrounded her work environment. David called every day, conversations that grew increasingly strained as it became clear we were both waiting for the other to make the first move toward reconciliation. He'd had another conversation with his mother, he told me, and she was willing to apologize if I was willing to meet her halfway on understanding her perspective. "What does that even mean?" I asked during one particularly frustrating phone call. "I think she wants you to acknowledge that she was trying to help, even if she went about it the wrong way." The suggestion that I should apologize for my reaction to being robbed made it clear that David still didn't understand the fundamental issue. His mother hadn't made a mistake. She had made a choice to disrespect me, and she would continue making that choice until someone forced her to face consequences. "I'm not apologizing for being angry about having my car stolen," I said firmly. "She didn't steal it, Sophia. She sold it and gave you the money." The fact that David could still frame his mother's actions as anything other than theft told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties lay. Our conversations became shorter and less frequent as the days passed. Meanwhile, Austin was working its magic on me in ways I hadn't expected. Hannah's social circle included designers, musicians, entrepreneurs, and artists who talked about their work with a passion that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with creative industries in the first place. I found myself sketching again for the first time in months, filling a notebook with ideas and observations about the city's visual identity. 2 weeks into my stay, Hannah suggested I might want to look at some job opportunities, not because she wanted me to leave, but because she thought I might benefit from having a project to focus on. Her company was growing rapidly, and they were looking for a senior graphic designer who could help develop their brand identity as they expanded into new markets. "I'm not saying you should take the job," she said over breakfast at our favorite food truck. "I'm just saying maybe it would help you figure out what you want your life to look like if you had some options to consider." The interview process was unlike anything I'd experienced in Denver. The team at Sustainable Tech Solutions was genuinely interested in my ideas, my vision for how design could communicate environmental responsibility without sacrificing aesthetic appeal. They asked about my background, my creative process, and my thoughts on the company's mission rather than focusing on whether I fit their predetermined mold. Marcus Thompson, the creative director, was particularly engaging during our conversation. He was probably in his mid-30s, with an easygoing manner that masked a sharp intelligence and genuine passion for his work. Unlike the stilted corporate interviews I'd endured in Denver, our conversation flowed naturally from design theory to sustainability practices to the challenges of building a creative team in a competitive market. "We're not just looking for someone who can execute designs," he explained as he showed me around their office space, which was filled with natural light and living plants. "We want someone who can help us think strategically about how visual communication can advance environmental consciousness. It's a big responsibility, but also a huge opportunity to do meaningful work." The position came with a salary that was significantly higher than what I'd been earning in Denver, along with equity in the company and the kind of creative freedom I'd only dreamed about. More importantly, it represented a chance to be part of something that aligned with my values and challenged me professionally in ways I hadn't experienced before. I asked for a week to consider the offer, though I was already beginning to imagine what my life might look like if I stayed in Austin permanently. Hannah was thrilled at the possibility of having me as a permanent roommate until I could find my own place, and I found myself looking at apartments online with a sense of excitement rather than obligation. The conversation with David about the job offer was the most difficult we'd had since I'd left Denver. "You're talking about moving to Austin permanently," he said, his voice flat. "I'm talking about considering an amazing job opportunity. What about us? What about our marriage?" The question hung in the air between us, transmitted across hundreds of miles of highway and weeks of growing distance. I realized that I'd been avoiding asking myself the same question, partly because I was afraid of the answer. "I don't know, David. What about our marriage? Are you going to set boundaries with your mother? Are you going to make it clear that she can't treat me the way she did ever again? I've been trying to work with her, to help her understand." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you're going to set boundaries. I asked if you're going to choose your wife over your mother when she's clearly in the wrong." The silence stretched, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. "It's not that simple," he finally said. "Actually, it is that simple. Your mother stole from me, lied about it, and then blamed me for being upset. Either you think that's acceptable, or you don't. Either you're willing to tell her it's unacceptable, or you're not. She's family, Sophia. So am I, or at least I thought I was." That night, I called the company and accepted the position. Marcus was delighted, and we spent an hour on the phone discussing start dates, project priorities, and his vision for expanding the creative team. His enthusiasm for the work was infectious, and I found myself looking forward to the challenges, ahead with an excitement I hadn't felt about work in years. Hannah opened a bottle of champagne when I told her about my decision, and we sat on her balcony overlooking the Austin skyline, talking about apartment hunting and the creative projects I'd be working on. "Are you scared?" she asked as we watched the city lights twinkle below us. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also more excited than I've been in months." "Good. Fear means you're taking risks worth taking." The next morning, I started looking for apartments in earnest. Austin's rental market was competitive, but I found a small one-bedroom in a complex not far from Hannah's place, with big windows and enough space for a home office where I could work on freelance projects. The lease required a substantial deposit, which I could cover thanks to the money from my stolen car. Another irony that wasn't lost on me. My first day at Sustainable Tech Solutions felt like stepping into a world where my ideas and expertise were genuinely valued. Marcus introduced me to the team as someone who would be instrumental in shaping the company's visual identity as they grew, and the projects he outlined were exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work I'd been craving. The company was developing a new line of solar panel systems for residential use, and they needed a complete brand identity that would communicate both technological sophistication and environmental responsibility. It was the kind of project that would require months of research, strategy development, and creative execution. Exactly the kind of work that had drawn me to design in the first place. "We want to change how people think about renewable energy," Marcus explained during our first strategy meeting. "Right now, solar panels are seen as either expensive luxury items or ugly necessities. We want to create a brand that makes them desirable, aspirational, something people are excited to have on their homes." The challenge was enormous and exciting. I threw myself into research, studying everything from Tesla's design philosophy to Scandinavian minimalism to the visual language of environmental movements. I conducted interviews with potential customers, analyzed competitors' marketing strategies, and developed mood boards that explored different approaches to communicating innovation and sustainability. Working with Marcus was unlike any professional relationship I'd had before. He pushed me to think bigger, to consider the broader implications of every design decision, but he also trusted my instincts and gave me the freedom to explore ideas that might not work. Our creative sessions often stretched late into the evening, fueled by coffee and the kind of intellectual excitement that made time disappear. "You have a gift for making complex ideas feel accessible," he told me one evening as we reviewed logo concepts. "That's exactly what this company needs as we grow." The compliment meant more to me than he probably realized. After months of having my judgment questioned and my capabilities diminished, working with someone who appreciated my skills and challenged me to grow felt like coming back to life. 3 weeks into the job, I was walking back to my apartment after a particularly productive day when my phone rang. David's number appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. Our conversations had become increasingly infrequent and strained, as it became clear that neither of us was willing to compromise on our fundamental positions about his mother. "Sophia," he said when I picked up, "we need to talk. We've been talking, David. Or trying to. No, I mean really talk, face to face. I want to come to Austin." The suggestion caught me off guard. Since I'd left Denver, David had been passive in our conversations, waiting for me to decide when I was ready to come home, rather than taking any active steps to address the issues that had driven me away. "Why?" I asked. "Because I miss you. Because I want to see where you're living, what you're doing. Because I think we need to have some conversations that we can't have over the phone." There was something different in his voice, a determination I hadn't heard since the early days of our relationship. Part of me was curious about what had prompted this change, but another part was afraid that seeing him would complicate the new life I was building. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I said. "Please, Sophia. Just give me a weekend. If you still want me to leave after that, I will." Against my better judgment, I agreed. David booked a flight for the following weekend, and I spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation. I'd grown comfortable in my new routine, confident in my new job, and settled in my new city. The prospect of revisiting the complications of my marriage felt like opening a door I'd carefully closed. Marcus noticed my distraction during our Friday morning meeting. "Everything okay?" he asked after I'd spent 10 minutes staring at a logo concept without offering any feedback. "My husband is coming to visit this weekend," I said, then immediately wondered why I'd shared that information. The husband you never mention." It was true. I'd been careful not to discuss my personal situation at work, partly because it was complicated, and partly because I wasn't sure how to explain it without making David sound terrible or making myself sound naive. "It's complicated," I said. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Most worthwhile things are. For what it's worth, you seem happier here than someone who's just taking a temporary break from their real life. That might be worth considering as you figure things out." His observation stayed with me through the rest of the day and into the weekend. I'd been thinking of Austin as a temporary escape, a place to gain perspective before deciding what to do about my marriage. But Marcus was right. I was happier here than I'd been in Denver, more engaged with my work, more excited about my future. The question was whether that happiness was due to the distance from my problems or the discovery of new possibilities. David's flight arrived Saturday morning, and I picked him up at the airport with a strange mixture of nervousness and curiosity. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the past month had aged him in ways that went beyond the usual stress of work and daily life. "This is really different from Denver," he said, as we drove through Austin's eclectic neighborhoods toward my apartment. "Different how?" "More colorful, I guess. More alive." I showed him around my neighborhood, introduced him to my favorite, food trucks, and tried to see the city through his eyes. He was polite, interested, asking appropriate questions about my job and my living situation, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, a formality that made conversation feel forced. That evening, we went to dinner at a restaurant Hannah had recommended, and David finally brought up the subject we'd both been avoiding. "I had another conversation with my mother," he said over appetizers. "Oh?" I told her that what she did was unforgivable, and that if she wanted any kind of relationship with us going forward, she needed to acknowledge that and apologize sincerely. The words should have made me happy, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. And she said she'd rather have no relationship with me than apologize for trying to help her family make better financial decisions. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had chosen her pride over her relationship with her son, rather than admit she'd been wrong. But more than that, David's willingness to deliver that ultimatum suggested he'd finally understood the magnitude of what his mother had done. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Despite everything Patricia had put me through, I knew that losing his mother's approval would be devastating for David. "Are you?" he asked, studying my face carefully. "Of course I am. I never wanted you to lose your relationship with her. I just wanted her to respect me." "But you're not coming back, are you?" The question I'd been dreading hung in the air, between us. Looking at David across the table, seeing the hope and fear in his eyes, I realized that my decision had been made weeks ago. I'd just been afraid to acknowledge it. The silence stretched between David and me like a chasm that had been widening for weeks without either of us wanting to acknowledge it. Around us, the restaurant hummed with the easy conversations of couples who weren't dissecting the remains of their marriage over shared appetizers. I watched David's face as he waited for my answer, seeing the man I'd fallen in love with underneath the exhaustion and disappointment that had become his default expression. "No," I said finally, the word coming out softer than I'd intended, but with absolute certainty. "I'm not coming back to Denver." He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting that answer but hoping he was wrong. "Because of my mother. Because of everything. Your mother, yes, but also because I've found something here that I didn't even know I was missing." David pushed his food around his plate without eating, a nervous habit I'd noticed during difficult conversations throughout our relationship. What happens to us? The question deserved honesty, even if the truth was going to hurt both of us. I don't know. I love you, David, but I can't go back to being the person I was in Denver. I can't go back to walking on eggshells around your mother and pretending that her behavior is normal. And I can't ask you to move here and leave your entire life behind just because I've found mine. Maybe I want to leave my life behind, he said quietly. The suggestion caught me off guard. Throughout our relationship, David had been the stable one, the planner who thought 5 years ahead and made careful decisions based on practical considerations. The idea of him making an impulsive life change seemed completely out of character. Do you? Or do you just want me to come back? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I don't know. All I know is that I miss you. And I hate the way things ended with my mother, and I feel like I'm living someone else's life back in Denver. The admission revealed more vulnerability than David had shown in months, but I could also hear the uncertainty underneath his words. He wasn't ready to make a dramatic change. He was just desperate to find a solution that would put his life back together the way it had been before. What would you do here? I asked gently. Your job, your friends, your whole support system is in Denver. I could find work. Software developers are needed everywhere. And then what? We'd both be starting over, but we'd still have all the same fundamental problems we had before. The way you handle conflict, the way I handle independence, those things don't change just because we change zip codes. David set down his fork and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we got married for the wrong reasons. Maybe we were in love with the idea of being together more than we were compatible for actually building a life together. The words felt like betrayal, even as I spoke them, but they also felt true in a way that made my chest ache. David and I had fallen in love during the honeymoon phase of our relationship, when our differences seemed charming rather than problematic. We'd gotten married without really testing whether we could handle the everyday stresses and compromises that real partnership required. You don't mean that, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I think I do, and I think you know it too, or you wouldn't have spent our entire marriage trying to manage the situation with your mother, instead of addressing it directly. David was quiet for the rest of dinner, and we drove back to my apartment in uncomfortable silence. He was staying at a hotel downtown, but I'd offered to show him more of the city the next day, partly out of politeness and partly because I wasn't ready for our conversation to be over. That night, I lay awake thinking about the life David and I had built together and the life I was building without him. The contrast was stark in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until I'd articulated them aloud. In Denver, I'd been constantly adapting myself to fit into David's family dynamic, moderating my opinions and reactions to keep peace. In Austin, I was free to be completely myself, to pursue work that excited me and relationships that energized, rather than drained me. The next morning, I took David on a tour of South Austin, showing him the food trucks and music venues that had become part of my regular routine. We stopped by the office so I could pick up some files I'd forgotten, and I introduced him to Marcus and a few other colleagues who happened to be working on the weekend. Impressive setup, David said as we walked back to the car. Very different from the corporate places in Denver. It's more collaborative here, less hierarchical. And your boss seems nice. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. Marcus is a good colleague and a talented creative. Director, just colleagues? The question surprised me, partly because David had never been the jealous type, and partly because I hadn't realized how comfortable I'd become talking about Marcus and our work together. Yes, just colleagues, I said. Though even as I spoke the words, I wondered if that was entirely true. Marcus and I had developed an easy rapport that extended beyond strictly professional interactions. and I'd found myself looking forward to our meetings and creative sessions in ways that had nothing to do with career advancement. He looks at, "You like you're more than just colleagues." David's observation made me uncomfortable because it forced me to examine feelings I'd been carefully avoiding. Marcus was attractive, intelligent, and passionate about his work in ways that reminded me of what had initially drawn me to David. But more than that, he saw me clearly, my talents, my potential, my ideas, without needing me to diminish myself, to make him comfortable. Even if that were true, I said carefully, it wouldn't change anything about our situation. Wouldn't it? We spent the rest of David's visit having the kinds of surface-level conversations that avoid the emotional, landmines lurking underneath every topic. He flew back to Denver on Sunday evening, and we both knew it would probably be the last time we saw each other as husband and wife, even though neither of us was ready to say it aloud. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. The solar panel branding project was consuming, requiring research into everything from color psychology to environmental messaging to manufacturing aesthetics. Marcus and I worked closely together, often staying late to refine concepts or explore new creative directions. "You know you don't have to solve every design problem in the first month," he said one evening as I reviewed logo variations for what was probably the 20th time that day. "I know. I just want to get it right." "It's already right. You're just afraid to stop working because then you'll have to think about other things." His insight was uncomfortably accurate. Work had become my refuge from the emotional complexity of ending my marriage and starting over in a new city. As long as I was focused on color palettes and typography, I didn't have to think about divorce lawyers or the practical logistics of completely disentangling my life from David's. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. "Only to someone who's used the same coping mechanism," Marcus replied. "I threw myself into building this company when my marriage ended 3 years ago. Worked 16-hour days for months until my business partner staged an intervention." The revelation that Marcus had been through a similar experience made me see him differently. I'd assumed his dedication to the company was purely professional ambition, but now I understood it might have been motivated by the same need to rebuild an identity outside of a failed relationship. "What happened?" I asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. We wanted different things. She wanted the suburban house and the minivan and the predictable life. I wanted to build something meaningful, to take risks, to create rather than just consume. Neither of us was wrong, but we weren't right for each other. The parallels to my own situation were striking, but hearing Marcus describe his divorce in such matter-of-fact terms made me realize that ending a marriage didn't have to be a tragedy. Sometimes it was just the honest acknowledgement that two people had grown in different directions. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "The divorce?" "No. Getting married in the first place without really understanding what we both wanted from life? Sometimes." That night, I finally called a divorce attorney in Denver and scheduled a consultation. The conversation was businesslike and surprisingly straightforward. No-fault divorce, division of minimal assets, no children to complicate, custody arrangements. The lawyer estimated the process would take 3 to 4 months if David and I could agree on terms without litigation. When I called David to discuss the practicalities, he was quiet for a long moment after I explained what the attorney had outlined. "So that's it?" he said finally. "That's it. Clean break, no drama, no blame. We just acknowledge that we made a mistake and move on with our lives." "What about the apartment, the furniture?" "You keep it all. I don't want anything that reminds me of Patricia's interference in our lives." David laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "She really destroyed us, didn't she?" "She revealed problems that were already there," I corrected. "We just weren't honest enough with ourselves to see them." The divorce proceedings moved forward with remarkable efficiency. David was cooperative and fair. and we managed to dissolve our marriage with more grace than we'd shown in sustaining it. By October, I was officially single again, with a new last name on my driver's license and a sense of closure I hadn't expected to feel. Meanwhile, my work at Sustainable Tech Solutions was gaining recognition both within the company and in the broader design community. The solar panel branding campaign had launched to enthusiastic response from customers and industry analysts, and Marcus had begun talking about expanding my role to include oversight of all visual communications for the company's product lines. "We're growing faster than we anticipated," he explained during a strategy meeting with the executive team. "We need someone who can scale our creative operations while maintaining the quality and consistency that's become our signature." The promotion came with a significant salary increase and equity stake that would vest over 4 years, but more importantly, it represented the kind of career opportunity I'd dreamed about but never thought I'd actually have. I would be building a creative department from the ground up, hiring and mentoring designers, shaping the visual identity of a company that was pioneering sustainable technology solutions. "Are you sure I'm ready for this?" I asked Marcus privately, after the meeting. "I'm sure you're the only person I trust to do it right," he replied. "You understand both the creative and strategic sides of what we're trying to accomplish. Plus, you have something most creative directors lack. You actually care about the mission beyond just the aesthetic outcomes." The confidence he expressed in my abilities was intoxicating after years of having my judgment questioned and my competence undermined. More than that, working with Marcus felt like genuine partnership, the kind of professional collaboration where ideas built on each other rather than competing for dominance. As Austin settled into its mild version of winter, I found myself happier and more fulfilled than I'd been in years. My work was challenging and meaningful, my friendships were deepening, and I'd developed a routine that included weekend hiking trips to the hill country and regular attendance at the city's numerous music festivals. Hannah noticed the change in me during one of our Sunday morning coffee rituals. "You're different now," she observed as we sat on her balcony watching the joggers and dog walkers navigate the trails below. "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you're not carrying around a weight you don't want to talk about." The observation was accurate. The constant tension I'd lived with in Denver, the need to monitor Patricia's moods, manage David's avoidance, and moderate my own reactions to keep peace, had dissipated completely. I woke up each morning excited about the day ahead, rather than anxious about potential conflicts. I think I'm finally living my own life, instead of trying to fit into someone else's version of what my life should look like, I said. "And how does it feel?" "Like I can breathe." That evening, Marcus and I worked late on a presentation for potential investors, refining slides that would showcase the company's growth and future potential. The work was detailed and demanding, requiring us to sit close together as we reviewed financial projections and market analysis on my laptop screen. "This chart needs to be clearer," Marcus said, pointing to a section that showed our customer acquisition rates. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the mouse, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through me. I'd been so focused on recovering from my divorce and establishing my career that I hadn't allowed myself to consider the possibility of romantic interest in anyone. But sitting there in the quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of our successful collaboration, I realized that my feelings for Marcus had evolved beyond professional admiration into something more personal and complex. "Sophia," he said quietly, and I realized he'd noticed the moment of tension between us too. "I know," I replied, though I wasn't sure what either of us was acknowledging. "I don't want to complicate things for you. I know you're still figuring out your life after the divorce." The consideration he showed for my emotional state, his willingness to prioritize my well-being over his own interests, made me understand why I'd grown to care for him so deeply. Marcus wasn't pushing for anything I wasn't ready to give, wasn't trying to rush me into decisions I might regret. "What if I'm ready for some complications?" I asked, surprising myself with my directness. He studied my face carefully, and I could see him weighing the potential consequences of crossing the line from colleagues to something more personal. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, I leaned forward and kissed him, a gentle exploration that confirmed what I'd been suspiciously avoiding for weeks. The attraction was mutual, the connection was real, and the timing felt right in ways that my relationship with David never had. When we broke apart, Marcus smiled in a way that transformed his entire face. "I've been wanting to do that for months," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed to choose Austin for Austin, not because of me. You needed to know you could build a life here that was entirely your own." The insight revealed how well Marcus understood both my situation and my personality. He'd watched me rebuild my confidence and establish my independence without trying to insert himself into the process. He'd supported my professional growth and respected my emotional boundaries while making it clear that he valued me as both a colleague and a person. "And now?" I asked. "Now I'd like to see if we can build something together that's even better than what we've created separately." The conversation felt like the beginning of something entirely new, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience or compromise. As we packed up our work and prepared to leave the office, I realized that Patricia's theft of my car had set in motion a chain of events that had led me to exactly where I needed to be. Walking to our cars in the parking garage, Marcus took my hand with a naturalness that suggested this transition from colleagues to something more was long overdue. The simple gesture felt like a promise of possibilities I was finally ready to explore. "Dinner tomorrow?" he asked as we reached my car. "I'd like that." As I drove home through Austin's tree-lined streets, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been living a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt increasingly constrained and diminishing. Patricia's betrayal had forced me to confront truths about my marriage and my own priorities that I might have avoided indefinitely. Now I was building a career that challenged and fulfilled me, living in a city that energized rather than drained me, and beginning to explore a relationship with someone who saw my potential rather than my limitations. The transformation felt so complete that I could barely recognize the woman who had sat in that Mexican restaurant, staring at her phone in disbelief as she watched her car being stolen. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia's attempt to control and diminish me had actually liberated me from a life that was never truly mine. Her cruelty had been the catalyst for discovering my own strength. Her manipulation had forced me to establish boundaries I'd been too afraid to set, and her theft had given me the freedom to start over completely. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for Patricia, but for the resilience I'd discovered within myself, and the courage I'd found to build a life that reflected my values rather than other people's expectations. 2 years had passed since I'd left Denver with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, and the transformation felt so complete that sometimes I barely recognized my old life. Austin had become home in ways Denver never had, with its creative energy and genuine community of people who valued authenticity over appearances. My relationship with Marcus had evolved into something steady and supportive, built on shared passions and mutual respect, rather than compromise and accommodation. Sustainable tech solutions had grown exponentially, and my role as creative director had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd first walked into their offices. Desperate for a fresh start, we now had offices in 3 cities, and I was overseeing a team of 12 designers working on projects that ranged from renewable energy campaigns to sustainable fashion initiatives. The work was exactly what I'd dreamed of doing when I'd first fallen in love with design: meaningful, impactful, and creatively challenging. Marcus and I had moved in together 6 months earlier, into a house in East Austin with a studio space where I could work on personal projects and a garden where we spent Sunday mornings drinking coffee and planning weekend adventures. The relationship, felt natural in ways that my marriage to David never had, built on a foundation of individual strength rather than mutual dependency. I thought about Denver rarely now, and when I did, it was with the detached curiosity of someone remembering a previous version of themselves. David and I had maintained minimal contact after the divorce was finalized, exchanging occasional texts about tax documents or forwarded mail, but our lives had diverged so completely that we might as well have been strangers who had once known each other briefly. That's why the email from Hannah surprised me so much when it arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. She'd moved back to Philadelphia the previous year for a promotion at her company, and we stayed in touch through regular video calls and socially. Media updates. But this message was different, urgent and cryptic in a way that made me call her immediately. "You're going to find this interesting," she said without preamble when she picked up. "I'm at a conference in Denver, and guess who I ran into at the hotel bar last night?" "I have no idea, and I'm not sure I want to know." "Patricia Chen, and she's got some news about her precious son that I think you should hear." The mention of my former mother-in-law sent an unexpected chill down my spine. I'd successfully avoided thinking about Patricia for months, and hearing her name brought back memories of the violation and manipulation that had ultimately changed the entire course of my life. "Hannah, I really don't want to hear about Patricia. Or David. That chapter of my life is closed. Trust me, you want to hear this. David's getting married again." The news should have felt like final closure, confirmation that we'd both moved on completely. Instead, it stirred up something complicated and uncomfortable, not jealousy exactly, but a strange mixture of curiosity and concern. "Good for him," I said, trying to sound indifferent. "To his mother's housekeeper." That information stopped me cold. Patricia had employed the same woman, Maria, to clean her house for over a decade. She was probably in her early 40s, a quiet, hard-working single mother who had always treated me with more warmth and respect than Patricia ever had. "That's unexpected," I said carefully. "It gets better. Apparently, Patricia is furious about it. She's been trying to break them up for months, and when that didn't work, she started spreading rumors about Maria around their social circle. But here's the really interesting part. David finally stood up to her. I found myself genuinely curious despite my intention to stay detached from Denver drama. The David I'd known had never been capable of defying his mother directly, preferring to manage conflicts through avoidance and diplomatic compromise. What did he do? He told Patricia that if she couldn't treat Maria with respect, she wouldn't be welcome at their wedding or in their lives afterward. And when she called his bluff, assuming he'd back down like always, he actually followed through. They haven't spoken in 6 months. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had finally found the backbone to set boundaries with his mother, but it had taken falling in love with someone else to give him the motivation to do it. I wondered if Maria knew how lucky she was to be dating the version of David who had learned to prioritize his partner over his mother's approval. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Because Patricia spent 20 minutes last night complaining to anyone who would listen about how her son had been ruined by ungrateful women who didn't understand family loyalty. She's completely rewritten history to make herself the victim in all of this. The revelation didn't surprise me. Patricia had always been skilled at crafting narratives that painted her as the misunderstood martyr, the devoted mother whose sacrifices went unappreciated by selfish children and their unsuitable partners. That's exactly what I would expect from her. But here's the thing that I think you need to know. She's apparently been telling people that you ran off to Austin with some man you were having an affair with while you were married to David. She's been painting you as the cheater who destroyed her family. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because I believed it mattered what Patricia said about me, but because the lie was so deliberately cruel and so completely fabricated. She was rewriting our entire history to make me the villain. and herself the innocent victim of my selfishness. "That's ridiculous," I said. But even as I spoke, I could feel anger building in my chest. I know it's ridiculous, and anyone with half a brain would know it's ridiculous. But she's been spreading this story for 2 years now, and some people believe it. She's poisoned your reputation with people who knew you in Denver. The unfairness of it was breathtaking. Patricia had stolen from me, manipulated my marriage, and driven me out of the city, and now she was telling lies about my character to justify her own behavior. The fact that people might actually believe her version of events made me furious in ways I hadn't expected. "What do you want me to do about it?" I asked Hannah. "I live in Austin now. I have a new life. What Patricia says about me in Denver doesn't affect anything that actually matters. Maybe not directly, but don't you want to set the record straight? Don't you want people to know the truth about what really happened?" The question forced me to examine my own motivations. Part of me wanted to stay above the fray, to maintain the dignified silence I'd chosen when I left Denver. But another part of me was tired of letting Patricia control the narrative, tired of her facing no consequences for her actions while I was painted as the villain in her version of events. What would be the point? Anyone who really knew me wouldn't believe her lies anyway. The point would be justice. The point would be not letting her get away with destroying your reputation on top of everything else she did to you. That evening, I told Marcus about Hannah's call and Patricia's campaign of character assassination. His reaction was immediate and protective. "That's defamation," he said. "You could sue her for spreading false information that damages your reputation." In theory, yes. In practice, it would be expensive and time-consuming, and it might just give her lies more attention than they deserve. "So you're just going to let her get away with it?" The question echoed Hannah's challenge, and I realized that my reluctance to respond wasn't entirely about taking the high road. Part of it was fear of reopening old wounds, fear of giving Patricia more power to hurt me, fear of being dragged back into drama I'd worked so hard to escape. "I don't know," I admitted. "I need to think about it." Over the next few days, I found myself distracted by thoughts of Patricia and her lies. The work that usually consumed my attention felt secondary to the growing sense that I needed to do something to reclaim my own story. But I also knew that any response had to be strategic rather than emotional, calculated rather than reactive. The solution came to me during a brainstorming session with my team about a new campaign for electric vehicle charging stations. We were discussing the importance of authentic storytelling in building brand trust, when I realized that the same principles applied to personal reputation. The most powerful way to counter false narratives wasn't to engage in arguments or denials. It was to tell a better, truer story. That weekend, I started working on something I'd never attempted before, a comprehensive blog post about my experience with emotional abuse and manipulation within families. I didn't name Patricia or David or provide specific details that would identify them, but I told my story honestly. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the theft that had finally forced me to recognize the pattern of control and disrespect. More importantly, I wrote about the recovery process, the journey of rebuilding confidence and establishing independence, the discovery of what healthy relationships actually looked like. I wrote about the professional success I'd found when I was finally free to pursue my own goals, the personal happiness I'd discovered when I stopped trying to accommodate other people's dysfunction. The post was long, nearly 3,000 words, but every sentence felt necessary. When I finished, I had created something that was simultaneously a refutation of Patricia's lies and a resource for other people who might be struggling with similar situations. Marcus read the draft and was quiet for a long time afterward. "This is powerful," he said finally. "But are you sure you want to put it out there? Once it's published, you can't take it back." "I'm sure. Patricia has been controlling the narrative about my life for 2 years. It's time for me to tell my own story. I published the post on Medium and shared it on my professional social media accounts, along with a brief note explaining that I was sharing my experience in hopes that it might help others recognize and escape similar situations. I didn't mention Denver or anyone by name, but I did include details about the car theft that would make it clear to anyone who knew the real story exactly what I was referring to. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times and had generated dozens of comments from people sharing their own experiences with family manipulation and emotional abuse. Several people I'd known in Denver reached out privately to express support and to share their own suspicions about Patricia's version of events. More importantly, the post felt like a reclaiming of my own narrative. For 2 years, I'd allowed Patricia to define the story of my marriage and divorce through her lies and manipulations. Now I had told the truth, not as a defensive response to her accusations, but as an authentic account of my own experience and growth. 3 days after the post went live, I received an unexpected phone call from David. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Sophia," he said when I picked up, "I saw your blog post." "David, congratulations on your engagement. By the way, thank you. Listen, I need to tell you something. About my mother and the things she's been saying about you. Hannah told me about the rumors. It's fine, David. I don't live in Denver anymore, and I don't care what Patricia says about me. But it's not fine. She's been lying about you for 2 years, and I never said anything to stop her. I should have defended you, should have told people the truth about what really happened." The apology was unexpected, and I could hear genuine remorse in his voice. It occurred to me that David's relationship with Maria had probably given him new perspective on what partnership actually looked like, and perhaps new insight into how badly he'd failed to support me when we were married. "Why didn't you?" I asked, because it was easier to let her think she was right than to admit that I'd been wrong. Because I was ashamed of how I'd handled everything with you, and it was simpler to let her blame you than to take responsibility for my own mistakes. The honesty was refreshing, even if it came 2 years too late. I realized that David had grown in ways that might have saved our marriage if the growth had happened earlier. "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "Your blog post made me realize how much damage my silence has caused. I've been enabling her behavior my entire life, and I let her destroy your reputation because I was too cowardward to stand up to her. You're standing up to her now, though. Hannah told me about the situation with Maria. Yeah, well, it took me long enough to figure out that my mother's approval isn't worth sacrificing my happiness or my integrity." We talked for another few minutes about his engagement and my life in Austin, and the conversation felt like the closure our divorce had never really provided. David had finally become the man I'd hoped he could be when we got married, but it had taken losing me and finding someone else to motivate that growth. After we hung up, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. David's acknowledgement of his failures didn't change anything about our past, but it confirmed that my decision to leave had been the right one for both of us. He'd needed to learn how to be a partner without my accommodating his avoidance, and I'd needed to learn how to be myself without his mother's constant criticism. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation from David and Maria. Not because we were close, but because he wanted to demonstrate publicly that he respected the woman I'd become and the choices I'd made. I declined the invitation, but sent a thoughtful gift and a note wishing them happiness. Around the same time, Marcus and I got engaged during a weekend trip to the hill country, and I realized that this relationship represented everything I'd thought I wanted with David but had never actually experienced. Marcus proposed not because we needed to prove our commitment to skeptical family members, but because we wanted to celebrate a partnership that had already proven itself through challenges and growth. As I looked at the ring on my finger and thought about the life Marcus and I were building together, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. Patricia's cruelty had been the catalyst for discovering my own strength. Her manipulation had forced me to establish boundaries I'd been too afraid to set, and her theft had given me the freedom to start over completely. The woman who had sat in that Mexican restaurant, staring at her phone in disbelief as she watched her car being stolen, barely existed anymore. In her place was someone who had learned to value herself, to demand respect, and to build a life that reflected her own values rather than other people's expectations. Patricia had tried to diminish me and had instead set me free. Her betrayal had been the gift I'd never asked for but desperately needed, the push to discover who I really was and what I was actually capable of achieving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.